Thanks, Matt, for the introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to attend the other talks. I'm based in the Netherlands now, and it's 1:30 a.m. here. So haven't attended the other ones. I've caught up on some of them after the fact, but I'm very excited to be here, even though it's quite late. I also want to start by just saying, so this is the Gamelan Masters series, and I want to qualify, I really don't consider myself a master of the gamelan in any sense. I am a student of the gamelan, and I've played in ensembles in Chicago, in Indonesia, and now in the Netherlands. And in my research, I interview and I learn from masters of the Surinamese gamelan tradition. And I would have liked to invite some of them to participate in this, but yeah, because of the time difference, it wasn't really possible, but maybe there will be some other opportunity in the future. So just to give a little outline of the talk, I'm gonna talk about the history that brought Javanese people to Suriname and from Suriname to the Netherlands. And I'm gonna then describe a little bit the Javanese gamelan tradition as it has developed in Suriname. And then I'll show a little montage of video clips in the middle that just shows, some clips from various contexts from my fieldwork. And then at the end, I'm gonna talk about my sort of theoretical approach to this research, which I've been combining ethnographic and archival research and kind of aiming to understand the tradition in the context of its historical origins in a colonial labor migration and how that sort of shapes its meaning in the present. Okay, all right. So this is a map of the Dutch colonial empire. I'm sure that everyone who's here tonight is familiar with Indonesia, where it is on the map, and perhaps knows some things about its history as the colonial Dutch East Indies. But perhaps there is a bit less familiarity with another Dutch plantation colony on the other side of the world, and that is Suriname, also known as Dutch Guiana, which is located here on the Caribbean coast of mainland South America and was under the control of the Dutch until it gained its independence in 1975. At present, Suriname is a country with a population of just over 500,000 people, bordered by rivers and jungle, and still maintains a lot of official and unofficial ties with the Netherlands, including having Dutch as its official national language. Almost half of Suriname's occupants reside in its single city, the capital, Paramaribo, while the rest of the population is spread along the former plantation area along the coast, as well as in the vast but sparsely populated jungle interior that occupies more than 80% of the country's surface area. In 1863, the enslavement of Afrodescendants as plantation laborers was abolished in Suriname, which followed slightly behind the trend across other European colonies in Latin America and the Caribbean. Freed Afrodescendants became Dutch colonial subjects, and many of them moved to the city to start businesses there and to eventually form the Creole social and political elite of the country. But that left the question after 1863, who would then work on the remaining plantations, which were mostly owned by absentee European planters investing from afar in the production of sugar, coffee, and other crops mass-produced for export. So as a solution, between 1890 and 1939, a total of almost 33,000 people were brought from the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, to the Caribbean colony on the other side of the world, with the vast majority arriving as indentured laborers and remaining in Suriname after their 5-year contracts had expired. There are now about 75,000 Surinamers of Javanese ethnicity in Suriname, comprising one of the main ethnic groups in the ethnically plural nation, as well as a sizable community, about 13,000 Javanese Surinamers in the Netherlands, where many Surinamese people migrated around Suriname's independence in 1975. So over the last several years, I've conducted ethnographic research with Javanese communities in Suriname and Javanese-Surinamese communities in the Netherlands, as well as in Dutch colonial archives. My research investigates the distinct gamelan tradition that's developed in Suriname since the early 20th century and its relationship to a colonial labor migrant history and the group of musicians in both Suriname and the Netherlands who keep the tradition alive today. These workers who were brought from the Dutch East Indies to Suriname between 1890 and 1939 were recruited from Central, East, and West Java, but also had origins that reached as far as Madura, Sumatra, and even Kalimantan. And some of those recruited were already internal migrants who'd moved between Indonesian islands and ended up near port cities in Java. And I put recruited in quotes because later accounts of these recruitments alleged all sorts of methods of coercion and trickery. It was not entirely a voluntary migration as it was painted in official documents at the time. These migrants arrived with 5-year contracts to work on Surinamese plantations. And for a variety of reasons, mostly beyond their control, most of the temporarily contracted workers never returned to Indonesia and instead started a new life in Suriname. The act of migration itself transformed a disparate group of people from the Dutch East Indies with different languages, belief systems, and cultural practices into the Javanese of Suriname, as they're known. Today, 13.7% of Suriname's population self-identifies as Javanese. This group coexists with other population groups with different colonial labor histories that now constitute Suriname's various ethnic groups, which together form a society that is often described as ethnically plural. So here are a few images that capture this idea of Suriname's ethnic plurality, and they come from historical documents, tourism websites, local ads, also found in government official documents. And the typical image of ethnic plurality shows everybody kind of holding hands and smiling together, each in their traditional clothing. And here you can see Javanese is represented as one of the main groups in these kinds of images, especially because it's unique to Suriname. No other significant populations of Indonesian migrants are anywhere else in the Caribbean due to the particular Dutch history of Suriname. And the other groups depicted here are Hindustani, which is the Surinamese term for people descended from British Indians, also contract laborers, Chinese, Afrodescendants, which are sometimes divided into the urban Creole population and the forest-dwelling Maroon population, and Suriname's original indigenous occupants, which now constitute a very small percentage of the population. So this idea of ethnic plurality is kind of a familiar formula across the Caribbean region that I'll talk a bit about more later. They vary slightly depending on each country's particular history of European domination. There's plenty of scholarship on this notion of ethnic plurality in the Caribbean, including critiques that point out that this formulation often leads to seeing different ethnic groups as homogeneous units that pass down statically heritable cultural and physical traits to its members, while maintaining notions of profound difference between members of different groups. Ethnic or cultural diversity, or the collection of several different groups into a harmonious society, then becomes the celebrated basis for a national identity, as well as a cultural tourism industry. So just to restate here, laborers traveled from various places in the Dutch East Indies to Suriname, and thus were formed into a new cultural unit that was governed together sort of as a homogeneous unit, known as the Javanese, which are now one group alongside others in Suriname's ethnically plural society. And to briefly add another important step to this history, in 1975, Suriname gained independence from the Netherlands in a bloodless transfer of power that was nevertheless surrounded by economic, political, and ethnic tensions and violence within Suriname. And this led to a large wave of migration of Surinamese people from all ethnic groups to the Netherlands. Javanese Surinamers settled in enclaves in a number of places in the Netherlands, including The Hague and some smaller communities in the far north and south of the country. Also in the Netherlands are a number of other population groups of Indonesian descent, which reflects the Netherlands' complex colonial relationship with the Dutch East Indies, including a large population of Dutch people with mixed European and Indonesian ancestry, known as Indos or Indies. Javanese-Surinamese is thus a transnational identity and community that is a bit peripherally positioned to a number of other colonial histories. The Dutch imaginary of Surinamese people often includes Afro-descendants and West Indians, but leaves out Indonesians from the equation. And Javanese-Surinamese people in the Netherlands are sometimes assumed to belong to the much larger population of Indos or Indonesian migrants. However, Javanese Surinamers have their own distinct music, language, food, and other forms of culture that developed along its own trajectory over the last 130 years. And these forms of culture are kept alive by cultural organizations, community music groups, performances at cultural festivals, Also, Javanese-Surinamese restaurants are very popular in the Netherlands, and so on, both in Suriname and in the Netherlands. Okay, now a little bit about music. Gamelan instruments have existed in Suriname at least since 1904. That is when the Nederlandse Handelmaatschappij, or the Dutch trading company, which owned and operated Marienburg, the largest sugar plantation in Suriname, imported a set of Central Javanese court-style gamelan instruments from Semarang, so that its large force of Javanese contract workers would have something wholesome to do in their free time. The plantation administration served as gatekeepers to these instruments and used access to them as a reward. And the many smaller plantations surrounding Marienburg, which also housed a lot of Javanese workers, wanted their own sets of instruments, but did not have the means to acquire them. For these reasons, this initial set of bronze instruments, depicted here in this photo, quickly spawned a proliferation of new sets modeled after them, but built out of iron and other scrap metal, and constructed in simpler styles using types of techniques that can be found in other village traditions in Java and elsewhere. So this is the set of instruments at Marienburg. And this is another set of instruments in the town of Mungo in eastern Suriname around 1930. And here you can start to see the self-made kind of village style instruments that were made in Suriname. So the saran in the front to the viewer's right has you can see a less ornate wooden box structure. And at the back right of the photo, you can see both a large hanging gong that must have come from Indonesia, and then the edge to the right of that of a gong made in the Surinamese style, which is a smaller rectangular plate with a bossed knob suspended horizontally over a wooden box resonator. I made this little drawing on the bottom right, modeled after Peggy Choi's schematic drawing of the instruments of the Central Javanese Court Gamelan. So you can see, by comparison, the Surinamese instruments are, well, there's less of them, and they're somewhat more simple in structure. Here you go. The bonang, kumpul, katuk, kanong, and gong are all made of suspended rectangular iron plates that are pounded into this shape with an embossed knob. And the different sizes of saran, including the saran panarus, barung, and demung, consist of iron keys held onto wooden box frames with nails. Oh, and here's a picture of real instruments. So that's a bonang in the front, for example. And here's a set of instruments in Suriname made by one of my interlocutors, Pak Henny Kasaran. The other thing you can see here is that the instruments are typically up on legs, so the players actually sit on chairs to play them. The keys of Surinamese instruments were typically made from scrap iron in the 20th century, like railroad ties and spare factory parts. And now they're made from purchased plates of galvanized iron pounded into these shapes. And they're tuned to slendro. So here's another shot of the instruments that were built by Pak Henny a year or so ago for his gamelan group in Paramaribo. Not too different from Indonesia, the tropical climate of Suriname requires maintenance of the instruments' wooden structures and metal keys, and sometimes requires a new set to be made altogether. They're usually not kept in any sort of climate controlled situation, but more in people's like sheds and backyards. And there are only a few people in Suriname and in the Netherlands at this point who still have the skills and knowledge to make the instruments. In contrast to the peak years of gamelan performance and Javanese culture in Suriname that occurred in the decades after World War II, when allegedly every Javanese settlement in Suriname had its own gamelan group. At present, there are only 5 active gamelan groups in Suriname that perform regularly, and 8 groups in the Netherlands. In Mungo, for example, where the second archival photograph was taken, there's still a significant Javanese population, and there's a gamelan guru, and there's instruments, but the players only assemble for special occasions where they've been invited to perform. And the decline is attributable to a number of factors, which include, on the one hand, the typical kinds of reasons that traditional cultural practices decline in the modern world, which is, namely that people are just busy doing other things. But also Suriname's had a particularly sharp and painful economic decline over the last decades. And that's really reduced the expendable income that people might use to hire a gamelan group to perform at an event or to maintain instruments in a practice space. No one in Suriname makes a living as a dalang or a gamelan musician. The community is not big enough. And so people basically participate in these activities as a hobby. And it often requires putting in money rather than providing an opportunity to make money. Surinamese gamelan music is most typically seen accompanying wayang, dance, or jarang kapang, the latter of which has seen a big resurgence in popularity in recent years. The repertoires that accompany these genres are comprised of a subset of Javanese gendings, mostly short form pieces like sampaks and strepagans, along with some Surinamese innovations or variations on those gendings. Most recently, for Javanese Surinamers, both in Suriname and especially in the Netherlands, there are increased possibilities to travel to Indonesia, to trace family genealogy, or to learn more about Indonesian culture, or just for vacation. Through the Indonesian embassy in Paramaribo, there are a number of scholarships for young Surinamese students to go study music, wayang, and dance in Indonesia. And the embassy has also brought a number of artists and teachers from Indonesia to Suriname with the aim of strengthening the historical and cultural connection between the two countries after they're both independent from the Netherlands. And this has led to some instances of collaboration and blending of traditions, but also to debates about what is authentically Javanese and authentically Javanese-Surinamese. And one theme that has come up in my research is a resistance to this perception that in Indonesia, the gamelan tradition is being sort of modernized by being blended with popular music or instruments or other world traditions or contemporary dance or things like that. And some people in Suriname embrace those kinds of opportunities to bring music to new audiences. But I've also heard a lot of audience members sort of embrace the authenticity that they perceive in the Surinamese tradition, the idea that it hasn't really changed in the last 130 years. Yeah, so. Okay, so now I guess we'll share the link and everybody can go watch this video, which is a montage of clips from my fieldwork. There's 6 short videos, it's about 5 minutes in total. And it's just an array of situations and occasions where Javanese-Surinamese gamelan music is performed at present. So the videos are from both Suriname and the Netherlands. And just to give a little summary, the first is a celebration of the anniversary of Javanese arrival in Suriname, which is an annual holiday that's celebrated all over Suriname in Javanese communities. And this was taken in 2015, which was the 125th anniversary of the first arrival of Javanese workers in Suriname. And there were about 10 days of performances all over the country. And this recording was made at one of those. And then the second and third videos are both from community celebrations of the Javanese holiday Bersih Desa. And the first is in Paramaribo in 2017. And then the next one was the following year in The Hague. So kind of a Surinamese version, a Netherlands version. The fourth video is just a rehearsal of a gamelan group in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which just gives a little better view of the instruments without an audience. And then the last 2 videos are of jarang kapang performances with gamelan accompaniment, one in Suriname and one in the Netherlands. So we can go watch the videos, about 5 minutes, and then maybe I can take any urgent questions about the videos, and then can continue with the rest of my presentation and take some more questions at the end. stop screen sharing for a minute. I don't really know when everybody's back, but if does anybody want to ask or say anything? Someone's asking, what was the final video? The final video was a Jaran Kapang performance. It's a trance dance with using these horses that are woven out of rattan, and involves, so the last two videos were actually that. I think the second to last was in The Hague, and the last one was on a former plantation in Suriname. And that dance is, I think, from East Java. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And it involves this sort of choreographed part, and then the gamelan leads the dancers into trance. And in that last video, you can see them doing the trance dancing. And that also involves sort of like feats of strength and yeah, kind of like acrobatics. It's always young men who do it. And yeah, I've seen that. So it's very popular in Suriname, and I've seen it a couple times in the Netherlands. There's one Javanese-Surinamese group in the Netherlands who does Jaran Kapang. Yeah, someone once made a joke to me that the difference between Jaran Kapang in the Netherlands and in Suriname is one of the sort of feats of strength that they sometimes do is to kill a chicken with their bare hands. And that's not really allowed in the Netherlands for animal rights reasons. But that actually happened and as part of that what the last video is a clip of, was a full Jaran Kapang performance that involved that. Okay, let's see.
Kitsy, do you want to jump in and make a comment?
Sure. I'm not going to turn my video on because it's 6:30 in the morning, and it would be horrifying. But I'll just say I love this talk, Emily. It's so interesting. This whole idea of gamelan in Suriname is really fascinating. And my husband Pawakidi and I were just listening to the clips and noticing that the singing styles. I mean, it's one of the songs Dayo Tako was very much from solo. I think very very common here. And yet, one of the earlier clips, I can't remember which one, the sinden sounded very much like she was Banyuwangi style from East Java. And so nothing specific, just wanted to comment on how interesting the different singing styles are. And just a quick comment about Anam Soroto. Ki Anam Soroto here in Solo talks a lot about his trips to Suriname and how he performed wayang there a number of times in the 80s. And he always likes to, and I think the 90s, he likes to talk about how difficult it was for him to communicate with the sponsors and when he was sitting around before the performance, because it was uncomfortable for him. They were speaking all sort of low Javanese, and he was uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable speaking back to them. They were the sponsors. They were the honored sponsors that had flown him all the way over to Suriname and were taking him out to dinner. And he had to get used to it. He said it was a very interesting linguistic experience. He even owned land there for a while and had a lot of connections to Suriname. So,
cool. Yeah.
Anything you have to say, Emily, about wayang, I'd be really interested. Like if you happen to know other dalang that have been there, or
sure, yeah,
from anywhere, or anything about that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, yeah. So first of all, yeah, the singing is something that I just do not know much about at all. So that's really interesting to hear your insight into that. Just in my research, I've been led more towards people who are musicians, instrument makers, dalangs, but never the sindans, the psindans. And I'm not sure why that is exactly. Could have to do with some gender stuff, or just, I mean, yeah, the people who have these skills are often quite old at this point. But I haven't really accessed that much knowledge about the singing tradition. So that's super interesting, but that's also consistent with what I've sort of gathered from the musical tradition, is that there are all these elements that come from all of these different places in Java, and it's not really known exactly why. I mean, it's presumably just because those initial workers who came over were from all different sorts of places and sort of had these different memories of their different village traditions, and that all got incorporated into the Surinamese tradition, and that's something that's really embraced about it, I think.
Sure.
So
Thanks.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Also, regarding language, I've also heard that very funny anecdotes about these sorts of linguistic challenges that come out of, that's exactly right, that kind of like this more village tradition, like not court tradition of music, also with the Javanese language, it's, the lowest form of Javanese that traveled with, I mean, it was just a community of laborers who came to Suriname. So still today, people speak Javanese. I think older people sometimes speak Javanese as their first language. These days, people more typically, younger people speak Dutch as their first language, and maybe some Javanese or learn it later. There's lots of different languages in Suriname, and lots of different relationships with language. But in the Netherlands, when people come from Suriname and they speak Javanese fluently, Surinamese Javanese, and then meet people from Indonesia, there's often that instance where it's very awkward. People from Suriname sound very rude. They also use like kind of old-fashioned words and even incorporate some words from Dutch or from Surinamese Creole. And I've heard people say that they just speak English. Like if they go to Indonesia or if they meet an Indonesian person somewhere, or Dutch if it's in the Netherlands, but that, yeah, they would prefer to do that, to just use a different language altogether than to sort of negotiate those like those awkwardnesses about language. So yeah, I think that's very interesting too. And then Wayang, there's one Dalang in Suriname at this point, he's in his late 70s, and he learned how to do Wayang as an adult from a teacher who came from Indonesia to Suriname and took on a bunch of students who were, I think, like middle-aged at the time. And his name is Sato Sopowiro. He really became like the Dalang. He's kind of the Dalang in Suriname now. And he now has a student, I think maybe a few students, but one student who's now doing his own solo performances. And he's also, not young. So they do also sometimes bring Indonesian dalangs. I've seen that in Suriname too. Dalangs brought by it's often sponsored in part by the Indonesian embassy. And sometimes those dalangs will like do classes. And then there's a couple of dalangs in the Netherlands who are Surinamese. So yeah, it's a fragile tradition, I guess. It's not a lot of people have that knowledge in the Surinamese context, but there are Wayangs for different holidays, like Bersih Desa. There will be a Wayang at each different village with a lot of Javanese people in Suriname, and it'll be sort of the same one or two dalangs that go around and do that on consecutive weekends. Wayang performances are sort of the main, I guess, that and Jarang Kepang are like the two main situations that I've seen gamelan performed. So it's a tradition that's still alive, but not a lot of people have that knowledge.
May I make a comment a little bit here, Sumarsam? I like the fact that they play gamelan on the chairs. Maybe we should do that here too. Which is probably you're going to talk about that aspect of it. But Maya, you're not saying that the gamelan that they play, they made is a Surinamese style of their gamelan, do you? Because that's the kind of gamelan that I play when I was a young boy in the village in East Java. So I don't know where you're going to go from there into the fact that you mentioned something about modernized gamelan in Indonesia and things.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that the Surinamese style is, it's really a village style of gamelan, I think. And I've seen a lot of other instances of instruments that look a lot like that. So yeah, I think in that sense, the instruments are not some sort of radically different Surinamese style, but it's really in a continuum with other like non-court traditions. And I think use a lot of techniques from those traditions. And the style of playing too has a lot of elements from a lot of different, I think, non-court traditions. And then, so the idea of modernizing, I think is, it says more to me about how people listen and what people hear in sort of their tradition and what it means to them. And authenticity, the idea of authenticity and modernization and tradition, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the last part of my talk, but those are subjective ideas, and those are matters of what you hear and sort of what you perceive that to mean. And something that seems very important from what I've heard people describe their sort of listening experiences to the Javanese-Surinamese gamelan is that it's an important part of that identity to connect it to this labor migration and to sort of see that idea of an authenticity that's tied to that really significant moment in history that sort of created this population of Javanese people in Suriname who really have their own kind of identity. And I think that identity, it's a very small population in the world, or relative to Javanese people in Indonesia. So I think there's a lot of power in that, in sort of hearing this like authenticity in an own tradition and tracing it back to these like labor migrant origins. And I think the idea that gamelan is modernizing in Indonesia, so that comes from, I've seen some performances brought over by the Indonesian embassy in Paramaribo where it's like modern dance choreographed to gamelan music, or like a batik like fashion show with kind of modern clothes made of batik. So these sorts of innovations that I think the Indonesian embassy is very excited to bring to Suriname. And then it sort of meets this idea about having an own authentic tradition in Suriname that produces, I think, really interesting discourses about what culture means to people. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Looks like there's a question from Akko. Would you like to jump in, Akko?
Hi. Can you listen me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to ask about the wayang. Who made the wayang? If you already mentioned, I'm sorry, very, very sorry, but maybe I missed you mentioned, but I just want to hear who wrote the wayang, and is there anyone who can make wayang in Suriname?
Yeah, so in Suriname, there's mainly one dalang, and let's see, he was not the dalang of the clip that was actually one of his students who was performing the wayang in Suriname in the little montage of videos. In the Netherlands, there's two dalangs that I know, and perhaps a few more people with those skills. And the clip from the Netherlands is a wayang for Bersi Desa. And so there's like a particular wayang that's like appropriate for that occasion. And I guess both in Suriname and in the Netherlands, into that traditional story, there's inserted some various, diversions and improvisations. And especially in the Netherlands, that also incorporates, Dutch language and sort of modern life and modern life lessons and stuff like that. So there is some, innovation and creation as far as wayang. But yeah, it's only a handful of people who do that in both Suriname and the Netherlands in this Surinamese style or within the Surinamese community.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
A follow-up question to that from myself. Are there people in Suriname who make the puppets themselves, or are they imported?
Yeah, so that the dalang Paksapto in Suriname, I've seen his chest of puppets, and he had this collection that was like some that were donated from Indonesia or brought as a gift from Indonesia on various different occasions, possibly some that he got himself from Indonesia. He has been there. And then there were also some old puppets that had been made in Suriname that looked slightly different and were made of different materials. I don't know that here that anybody is actively currently making wayang puppets. There is somebody who makes Jarang Kupang horses in Suriname. And someone might have the knowledge to make puppets, but I'm not sure. I haven't encountered any instances of that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
We have a question from Ed Luna.
Hello there. So I just wanted to ask about the construction of the bonang. And it seems to me that maybe they are arranged in octaves, much like the solo and Jogja style. But I'm just wondering if there is sort of like, because I know from a lot of Pasisiran traditions that there is sort of like a bridge note, like in the middle of the array of gongs. So I'm just wondering, are they arranged in octaves, or is there this weird little thing in the middle of the row? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. As far as I know, it's in octaves. I'm not sure about the bridge note that you're mentioning. I haven't been aware of that, but in my experience, the bonang it functions like the Central Javanese style ones that I've played the same.
Okay, so it's mostly like octaves, just playing in octaves. And like alternating octaves, I notice.
Yeah. I think it's the same as the same layout of notes as other like court style bonangs are you saying that that's different?
Yes, so like in Cirebon, so they have this bridge note in the middle, and the way that the reason why they do this is I think some of their arrangements of bonang melodies really uses that middle note, that bridge note, because without which it would be rather awkward to play certain patterns.
Okay.
So that's how I understand it.
Yeah, but considering the fact that the Japanese in Suriname came from mostly Central Java and East Java, I think, maybe predominantly is from that two areas. I think probably it's just the same kind of arrangement of bonang like in Solo and in Surabaya or anything else.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Pak Medianto has his hand up. He's ready.
Hi, Pak Marsam. First is my mentor here, and everyone, and the special guest speaker here. But Emily, I have no idea you're from Chicago Learning and Gamelan, so I know them very well, and Masmet as well. I have several comments. One, as Mbak Kitsi mentioned, the sinden is like Banyu Wangen. To me, yes, the sound color, either she's from Banyuwangi or from Madura. That's for sure. You better, if you have time, just ask her where she's coming from. So it'll be, it's great in Sampa with Banyuwangi and Madura's singing style. And the second one, with the iringan, the accompaniment for the Jaran Kepang, it's a lantaran Banyumas. Exactly, that is from Banyumas. So I don't know is the relation, is there from Madura, from Banyuwangi, from Banyumas, and so on. If you can do more research also, maybe it's different groups, where's the group coming from. Then the last one, the comments about the gamelan, the bonang style that's we're learning that's also made by the whatever in Suriname. This is not a village gamelan style. There's one set of gamelan in SMKI Surakarta considered sacred, exactly like this, and also the case it also box like that. And this gamelan story, historically, the one in SMKI, Pak Sumarsam maybe remember, that's a gamelan renteng, the black one, Pak. Yes, so this gamelan was belong to one of the very rich Chinese, early 30s, something in Solo. And then the Kraton Solo, historically, that's what I just heard by, by talking, just no research, but it's just talking from the teachers to the teacher and then to the student. It's belonged to very rich Chinese, and then the king of Solo, I don't know what year, retreat this gamelan to the land of Pasar Gede. So that's why the Pasar Gede is lots of Chinese there, and is traded by the gamelan, and gamelan is keep it to the Kepatian of Kraton Surakarta. That's what I heard. So this is not village gamelan at all. As Pak Marsam said, is I also start playing this kind of gamelan and iron until I went to conservatory in 1977. Then I play bronze gamelan. Can you believe that? So I've been playing iron gamelan called gamelan renteng. The bonang is like this style until 77. Amazing. So it's not village gamelan. That's my point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to follow up on there. That's very interesting. Yeah, and yeah, perhaps I can ask you some more questions as well. But okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like we got a couple more questions. Mark Perlman has a question.
Hi, Emily. I'm sorry I joined late, but what I've heard has been quite wonderful and quite interesting, and reminds me a little bit of the tiny bit of research I did with the Javanese community in East Sumatra, where there was a similar labor migration, and where mostly villagers came from all over Java, and when they wanted to perform wayang or klenengan, they basically had to come up with a common denominator of knowledge of pieces and styles that they had in common, and ended up taking its own form. And when I asked them, when Javanese migrants came later, didn't they try to bring with them their own perhaps more direct or quote unquote authentic styles? And they said they would just adjust themselves to what we already had. And so it took on its own life. But specifically, I just noticed that in the videos, the kendang players were always playing niwo, that is, with the large head and the lower sounds in the left hand. Is that standard?
Yeah. Yeah. That's part of the Surinamese style. Mm-hmm.
Because that's, as far as I know, very common in the villages all throughout Java, though it's the opposite in Solo and Jogja, or at least Jogja in the 20th century. Things might have been different earlier. So that's a...
Yeah.
Except Pak Cokro.
The group that I've been playing with in The Hague, which is a group of Javanese Surinamers, they also play Indonesian repertoire and kind of mix things together. And they play on both, sometimes Indonesian Central Javanese court style instruments. They have a set of those, and then also Surinamese instruments. And yeah, so they'll sometimes like turn the drum around from one piece to the next to play from the Indonesian style to from the Central Javanese style to the Surinamese style, just between pieces. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's also, I think that is also something that's, it's sort of perhaps a paradox, but I think also really interesting that there's this sort of embrace of this idea of like authenticity and the idea that tradition maintains and doesn't change that much, but also the idea that it's a tradition that, because of that origin of incorporating memories and techniques and styles from all these different places that workers came from, that it is a tradition that can really embrace kind of new things and maybe even incorporate influences from Suriname and from other cultures in Suriname that's incorporated sometimes into wayang stories and that kind of thing. But so it's both a tradition that's kind of authentic, but also malleable in a way, kind of all embracing.
Forgive me if you've mentioned this already, but I didn't see any ginder or gambang in those clips. Are those instruments simply never present?
No, yeah, at least not in like a set of Surinamese instruments. And at first there was only like a gamelan kecil, like without even bonang, and then the bonang was an introduction at some point along the history, and now it's pretty like a bonang centric, I think, kind of style of playing. And I haven't seen ginder, gambang. No. So perhaps I could take more questions, or I could go on. There's sort of like another part of the presentation, and I could take some more questions at the end.
Yeah, Emily, I don't see anybody else jumping in here, so why don't
cool.
That sounds great.
I haven't been looking at the chat, but yeah, I don't. Maybe you have that.
Yeah, I'm taking care of the chat. Don't worry about that.
Cool. Okay. Cool. Thank you for all the questions and comments. And I also would love to continue the conversation. And I'm very curious about what other people hear in this tradition. I welcome just further communications. And okay. Share screen. Okay, so this last section is going to be, I'm going to get into a little bit of the theory that I'm bringing to this research. So away from the kind of ways that music and instruments are sound and their styles, but we can return to that in the questions if people want to, and shifting a little bit more into the theoretical frameworks that I'm bringing into this investigation. The history of gamelan in Suriname is inextricably bound with the history of contract labor. This quote heads the submission of the Javanese-Surinamese gamelan to the Dutch list of intangible cultural heritage, which is a project that a Javanese-Surinamese cultural organization based in The Hague has been spearheading over the last couple of years. This emphasis on the Surinamese gamelan's plantation origins recurs not just in talk about the gamelan and about Javanese-Surinamese culture, but also in acts of listening to and describing how the Surinamese gamelan sounds, placing emphasis on its chords rather than refined, timbres and playing styles, and its authentic nature, allegedly unchanged since the turn of the 20th century, versus other traditions that modernize and change with the time. And again, I emphasize here that hearing something as authentic is more a matter of listening and perception than an objective truth. Authenticity is, of course, a very complicated and kind of loaded term. In my own research on the gamelan in Suriname, I'm interested not only in asking how the context of Suriname influenced the performance and development of the gamelan, but also how did the presence of the Javanese gamelan influence the development of colonial policies and concepts of human difference in Suriname, especially in ways that still shape Suriname and Surinamese lives today. I'm hearing a little noise, just a reminder to everybody to mute. Thanks. Just to briefly give a little theoretical scaffolding to these questions, I situate this research in a general area of ethnomusicological investigation that I call the audibility of coloniality. And by coloniality, I mean the lingering logics and structures of colonialism. So in other words, colonialism has officially ended in many places in the world, but the logics of place and of understanding human difference that were formed during centuries of colonialism don't just disappear, and they often continue to inform post-colonial thought and behavior, both on societal and individual levels. And this school of thought includes scholars such as Walter Mignolo and Aníbal Quijano, and it has roots in Latin American philosophy that looks at the legacy of colonialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. And by audibility, I'm pointing to a way of thinking about music and sound that considers sound not just as a signal that's sent out and can be objectively measured and described, but as a relationship between a listener and something that is listened to. Our senses, such as listening, but not just listening, and how we perceive the meaning of the data that we receive from them is shaped by many factors, including long histories of understanding different sounds in relation to ideas of human difference. Hearing a sound that's perceived as musical produces or reproduces a notion of what music even is. So taken together in the idea of the audibility of coloniality, these terms suggest that through historical and ethnographic scholarship, there's a lot to be unpacked and examined in terms that we may think of as neutral or self-evident, such as music, voice, melody, tonality, noise, and in perceptions of sounds as being civilized or ancient, modern, popular, traditional, foreign, natural, and human. If we scrutinize these terms, we can often trace back ways of thinking and ways of hearing that were formed during centuries of colonial relationships and that still persist in sometimes very subtle ways. So just for further reading, if anyone's interested, some books that from this way of, from this like school of ethnomusicology or sound studies that have been influential to me are a couple of volumes of collected essays, Audible Empire by Ronald Rodano and Tejumola Olaniyan, and then Remapping Sound Studies, a recent volume from Gavin Steingo and Jim Sykes. And then a couple of monographs, Ana Maria Ochoa's Orality, which looks at European archives of exploration and listening in Colombia, and Singing the Classical, Voicing the Modern by Amanda Weidman. That's about North Indian classical music, but kind of looking at similar questions. So drawing from this body of literature and theory, my interest is in looking at how the very ideas of music and culture transform throughout this history of colonial migration that connects Indonesia, Suriname, and the Netherlands, and how musical listening is entangled with colonial policy and lingering notions of human difference. So to bring this back to the gamelan, looking in the historical archive, late 19th and early 20th century descriptions by Dutch and European travelers and writers characterize the Javanese gamelan as music like music behind ours in a sphere of deep mystery where we've never penetrated and is truly timeless or time becomes sound, and others describe it as the voices of human souls and as a singing soul itself. And through these and countless other descriptions in colonial scholarship and travel literature, Dutch ears, or sometimes Dutch educated ears, heard and inscribed the Javanese gamelan as a radically different music that connected a primordial Javanese character to the ancient, the timeless, and the superhuman or enchanted. And to Dutch colonial listeners, Javanese people collectively had an aesthetic tradition and thus emotion and interiority, though radically different from the aesthetics, emotions, and interiorities of individuals in the West. Such characterizations were perpetuated in scholarship, including that of Jaap Kunst, who was sponsored by the Dutch government to conduct musicology research in the East Indies. And Kunst's 600-page tome on the toonkunst, or tonal art of Java, was representative of the Indies-centric nature of ethnographic scholarship in the Dutch colonial empire, as well as the Java-centric nature of scholarship on the Indies, focusing largely on the cultural practices found in the court centers of the island. Since the arrival of Indonesian laborers, such hearings of Javanese music continued in Suriname, but now with a new frame, in contrast to the musics, cultures, and histories of the other groups that also resided in and around Surinamese plantations. This next quote is from a Dutch journalist who visited Suriname in the 1930s to write articles about the different populations for a periodical that circulated in the Netherlands. From time to time, walking in the Kultur town at sunset, one hears the sound of the gamelan, so nicely in harmony with the tropical nature, ringing out from the Javanese kampung. If compared to the beating on a Negro drum, one realizes immediately the great distance that lies between brown and black. So this sonic inscription from a Dutch visitor to colonial Suriname succinctly conjures a number of relevant elements. To Kessler's early 20th century Dutch ear, the timeless or ancient static sound of the gamelan blends with the natural landscape of the tropics. And when compared to Suriname's Afrodescendant populations, musical difference becomes an oral indication of differential personhood, suggesting an inherited primordial incommensurability that takes sonic form. Place, as in origins in Africa versus Asia, time, evoking an ancient tradition, and human difference, as expressed here in a racial terminology of brown and black, become sonically entangled in the ears of the white Dutch listener. So in this brief passage emerge the themes of sound, music, culture, nature, origin, unequal personhood, and a notion of essential difference that through Suriname's colonial history and post-colonial independent nationhood has come to be known as ethnicity. So the listener is essentially hearing ethnic difference in the very sound of the gamelan. I'll just show my face for a moment. So when Asian laborers were brought to the Caribbean, and specifically when Javanese laborers were brought to Suriname, the notion that Asian populations had culture and traditions shaped the policies that governed them as a labor force and as inhabitants of the colony, in contrast to the Afrodescendant and indigenous populations that had earlier been forcibly imported or discovered there. So just to condense a lot of the history very briefly, particularly under Suriname's colonial administration of the 1930s and 40s, the colonial laws shifted from a general policy of assimilation, by which formerly enslaved Afro-descendants were taught Dutch and made to become Christian and to become sort of appropriate colonial subjects. That shifted with the introduction of Asian populations to a policy of apartheid or separateness, by which Asian laborers and former laborers could practice their own religious traditions, speak and be educated in their own languages, including Javanese, and maintain their own cultural practices. Over the course of the 20th century, these policies of ethnic separation contributed to understanding Suriname's different population groups, each with their own history of labor, according to the rubric of ethnic difference. And it also contributed to a longstanding notion of ethnicity as something that is a homogeneous and static and inheritable category, and an understanding of culture as a resource for Surinamese people to use to participate in the ethnically plural nation. And through that sort of the resource of cultural performance and having an ethnic identity, one's role as a citizen in Suriname is strongly and often primarily defined by one's allegiance to an ethnic group. So that's evident, for example, in Suriname's national calendar of ethnic holidays, such as the Javanese Day of Arrival, which was the occasion for the wayang in the first video. Each different ethnic group in Suriname kind of has an equivalent holiday that celebrates their historical origins of arrival, and to celebrate them, they do don traditional clothing and perform traditional music and dance publicly. It's also evident in Suriname's system of political parties, which are essentially ethnic in nature and are based on mobilization and clientelism along ethnic lines. So that's another key occasion for cultural performance, such as gamelan music, traditional dance, and that's at political rallies. Gamelan and other kinds of Javanese cultural performance are used at the rallies of the Javanese political party to mobilize voters and to get them to vote for the Javanese political party specifically. So sort of mobilize ethnic allegiance, which gets entangled with politics. So my argument is that ways of hearing different musics in Suriname used musical perception to reinforce ideas about the positions of different groups of laborers in an unequal hierarchy of human difference, and in accordance to then govern those different groups differently. At the same time, the separate governance for different groups is actually what allowed the gamelan tradition to survive and develop in Suriname, because Javanese religious practices and language and cultural traditions weren't forced to be assimilated or eradicated like Afro-descendant and indigenous ones were. At the same time, listening to difference reinforced the notion that ethnicity and culture are these sort of static units that travel with people around the world, remaining unchanged and signifying inheritable, profound difference between different groups of people, which informs still some ways of thinking about ethnicity, culture, and race that remain today. I mean, in the Caribbean and everywhere. Let's share screen again. So by way of conclusion, I just wanted to share a final anecdote. In Suriname, I was taking a break from my gamelan-focused activities, and I was invited to a Winti Pray, which is an Afro-Surinamese spirit possession ritual that involves also music and dance. And so having the sort of ethnic plurality mindset, I went to this expecting it to be a sort of fully Afro-descendant event. It took place in an Afro-descendant community in a place that was historically the domain of Afro-descendants. And I didn't expect to see anything or anyone Javanese. But when I got there, as you, I think, can see in the photo, everybody was wearing dresses and headscarves that were in an Afro-Surinamese style, but that were made out of Indonesian batik material. And that was because it wasn't any sort of intentional kind of like ethnic fusion, but at this ritual, they were conjuring the snake spirit, and they needed to wear clothes that had brown and yellow with the colors of that particular spirit. And so Indonesian batik was sort of what was at hand because of the presence of Javanese people in Suriname. It's available in fabric stores alongside other kinds of fabrics. So it wasn't an intentional case of cultural fusion, but just an activity that was making use of the cultural materials at hand to sort of accomplish the purposes of the ritual. And to me, this was a little glimpse at how we sort of categorize things. This is Javanese, this is Afrodescendant, et cetera, and understand culture to take place strictly within these categories. But in actuality, culture is constantly seeping across the boundaries of categories and transforming into situations that are not so easily categorizable or understood according to the notions of culture and ethnicity and race, et cetera, that we might have. Of course, that's also true in Indonesia, as we've seen in lots of the other presentations in this series, and even in this conversation. Javanese cultures traveled around the Indonesian archipelago and transformed in various ways that perhaps don't easily lend themselves to schematizations that say, this sounds like this here, and this sounds like that here, but sort of are more fluid than that. So just as a sort of open conclusion, I think that even in an area sort of well-studied and well-documented as gamelan music, there's much more to learn and to hear and to experience that can complicate our ideas of what culture is and what music is, and how these things transform and adapt to people's actual lives and activities as they change over time. So thank you.
Cool, thanks, Emily. And you want to take some more questions now?
Sure.
People have any more questions? Okay. Yeah, if anybody has had any questions about that part or anything else, just post it in the chat and we'll call on you. Oscar has a question first. Oscar, do you want to jump on?
I just noticed that person on the far right looks like they're wearing a sarong.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's a piece of batik that's, yeah, I mean, there's also like an Afro-descendant kind of a sarong-like garment that's like a piece of fabric tied in a particular way. So yeah, it might be worn like in that style, but it is just like a big sheet of batik. Yeah.
I think Derek Gregory has a question.
Yes. First off, super fascinating stuff. I literally knew nothing about the country of Suriname at all, and now I'm like intensely fascinated. My question is, and maybe I got this wrong, but you can help me out, but you mentioned there were a lot of ethnic groups that like sort of made their way through colonialism and labor to Suriname, and I think you said that for whatever reason that the Javanese communities weren't like forcibly assimilated, or like basically didn't have the same kind of like colonialist experience that they did in Suriname as like African groups and other stuff. Do you know why that is without having to go into like too much detail?
Yeah, I mean, so there's documents that discuss sort of these policies, like in the Dutch colonial government, and it was very controversial. Yeah, there's quite a history there. But basically, when slavery was ended, the people who had been enslaved and were then freed were kind of like, then the policy was that those are now the colonial subjects in Suriname, and they're the colonists themselves. And so they need to speak Dutch and be Christian, and they can't practice, like what what were perceived as sort of pagan religions. So looking at these documents, the conversation sort of shifts when first laborers from British India come, and then people from the Dutch East Indies. There's also Chinese laborers, but with these Asian populations. So what I'm claiming in my research is that the way that they are described both as potential laborers and as people with culture and tradition, there's this argument that, so there's, this whole tradition of scholarship that's been done up to that point in the Dutch East Indies about the traditions and cultures of Indonesian people. I mean, my argument is that because of this knowledge about culture there, including gamelan music, that these Asian populations were seen as more sort of legitimate people with their own history, their own traditions, their own cultures that Afrodescendants and indigenous people weren't thought to have. So that's kind of the argument that I'm making in my research through looking at these colonial documents that discuss kind of whether to bring over people from the Dutch East Indies as laborers and how to govern them once they're there. And sort of ongoing debates about, I mean, not everybody agreed with that policy, but yeah, sort of at that point, everything shifted to a policy of like governing and letting live these different groups of people in their own, like just doing their own thing in their own sort of enclaves. Laborers and former laborers and Indonesians got to educate their children in their own languages, and so did British Indians. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a much bigger history, and that's really what I'm interested in my research, is how hearing music figures into that history and sort of understanding these different kinds of personhood that the colonial government saw. Yeah, I feel like I'm getting a little inarticulate. It's almost 3 a.m. here. I'll just point out. So
yeah, thank you.
Bear with me, please.
that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Can you take a couple more, Emily? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm enjoying
All
the
right.
conversation.
We got Otto's up. Otto's up.
Hey, Emily, great job. I was wondering if you could, this kind of goes against your second half of what you were doing, but I was just wondering, in the process of interaction between Indonesian musicians coming to Suriname, maybe in the past 30 years or something, you were kind of talking about how the authenticity and kind of creating this codification of Surinamese gamelan has happened. And I was wondering if you could point out any of the things that maybe became codified at that point. Is there like a repertoire of songs that are, the songs that you have to know? Is there, stuff like that, just playing styles, like do you have to play in a certain style, recommendations, heavily recommendations, stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that because it's a pretty small community with like a small number of kind of leaders, there are maybe styles of playing are kind of passed down from teachers to their students. Let's see. I guess, repertoire. There are some like kind of Surinamese standards. Like there's a Surinamese version of sampak that's kind of like the go-to thing for like introducing a group or introducing a dance or something like that. It's like a little bit different from maybe like a Central Javanese kind of standard sampak. So there's that kind of thing. Like the repertoire is like a subset of I think gendings that have sort of become the Surinamese repertoire and maybe have like a few notes different or something like that.
But it's done more by like teacher and kind of just like lineage that way than anything that's like, is it traced more by teacher, but there's no like schools? Or...
I think so. I mean, there actually is somebody in the Netherlands who is, who's writing a book of like repertoire that he's notating. So I guess in that sense, maybe just now there's sort of an effort to sort of like fix a documented set of like Surinamese repertoire. I have to, when that becomes available, that would be interesting, I think, to compare to sort of the knowledge that people have about Indonesian repertoire from many different places. But yeah, I think it's also just, a lot is sort of passed from individual teachers to their students. And
cool.
I think that goes for style too. And there's actually, I think there's actually a little bit of pride. I've also heard it said that like every Surinamese group has a slightly different style. And that's because of the teachers that they, like the whole lineage of teachers that they had who at some point came from different places in Indonesia. So I think that's an aspect of it too, is that there's this idea that even in two different villages next to each other or something, there's like slightly different styles of playing.
Sorry, for that, do you mean different teachers during like the historical, like in the early 1900s, or do you mean in more recent teachers as well?
Like, I guess the idea that is like passed down from those origins through like a whole lineage to the present. And people can usually trace like their lineage of like who their teacher was and who that teacher was, and maybe then where they came from in Indonesia originally, where their ancestors came from.
Cool, thank you.
All right, I have a question. I'm wondering if you noticed or if you ran into any non-Javanese Surinamese people who were interested in studying gamelan music in Suriname.
Yeah, that's a great question. Not a lot, but one of my best sort of interlocutors and like friends on this endeavor was actually a journalist who was not Javanese. He's a Chinese Surinamese guy. And I guess as a journalist, he was interested in culture and sort of studying this Javanese tradition from like an outsider perspective, which was, yeah, like a good kind of person to learn from. And we went to a lot of events as like audience members together. But in all, not really, as far as like gamelan classes that people could sign up for. I also took like a batik class. Like there's various classes in Indonesia, in Javanese-Surinamese culture in Suriname. And that's pretty much, the one exception to that I would say is pencak silat. That's like really popular with all different kinds of kids and teenagers. But the music is a little bit more divided, yeah.
Thanks.
I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but yeah.
Yeah. It also did definitely look like it was like mostly an older generation. Let's see here. So I think we have Derek Gregory has a question.
Yeah, last one, I promise. Have you noticed any kind of synchrony or kind of collaboration between the different musics in Suriname between gamelan? Is it pretty much exists like within a bubble in Suriname, like the tradition, or have people kind of adapted gamelan music in Suriname to like African or Asian or other musics that are also there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Mostly, no. There is this group in Suriname that's called Alakondra Drone. It's like mixed drums. And that group is like this very sort of intentional cultural fusion that takes people who play drums. So a guy who plays drum, who plays kendang and leads one of the gamelan groups. So he plays kendang, and then there's like a drummer from sort of like each cultural tradition. So a Hindustani person who's playing Hindustani kind of drum, I forget which one, and a couple of people who do like Afro-Surinamese drumming. And that's this group that was like very intentionally compiled, and they've toured internationally, I think. So they kind of represent, I mean, that's very much within this paradigm of kind of ethnic plurality, where it's like, this person does this, and this person does this, and this person does this, and then they can come together and sort of fuse them in this like display of like beautiful diversity. But what I see less is more like sort of casual insertions of different traditions into each other. I think that cultural performance is very much in the domain of like these separate ethnic groups. I'm sure there's exceptions to that too, but none that I can think of really. There is, like in the wayang, there's often during the part where there's more like improvisation and with the clowns and kind of like jokes and stuff, there's often like there will be characters from other groups in Suriname, like speaking different Surinamese languages and stuff. So they sort of make an appearance like in the Javanese, otherwise Javanese setting of the story.
Very cool.
But that, can I just interrupt a little bit here? But that also seems to be the same way how koro-koro and limbuan is being done in Java, right? But I would like to know a little bit more about your theoretical approach of this audibility. And I think you said music's shaped by histories of listening. Can you unpack a little bit more? But before you do that, from my perspective, the repertoire is really no much different than the repertoire that I know of from the village in East Java. Except, again, if you think of comparing with the Suriname style, that will be either a little bit rough in the kasar, perhaps, instead of pipilan, it will be kembyangan. I hear the pangkor, sampak, serpekan. It's very much the same, except it's a little bit different configurations. Yeah, but in any event, can you talk a bit more about that audibility that you mentioned?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And and it's good to. I'm also curious about this. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people here with much deeper knowledge than me about repertoire and styles in Indonesia. So it's very interesting to hear those insights. So the idea of audibility in this framework is, so to use the example of the gamelan, I think that the way that especially Western ears listen to the gamelan is shaped by this very long history of colonial scholarship and the writing that people have done about how gamelan sounds, both as scholarship and then also in other forms of literature like travel literature from the 19th century. And yeah, there's really an enormous body of the Dutch entanglement with Indonesia was so deep, and it produced so much literature, art, visual art, so many representations of what Europeans thought that Indonesian culture was and what it meant. And so my interest is in tracing this sort of contemporary ways of listening to see how they're still influenced by those origins, that the documents we turn to often in scholarship and in the West to learn about a tradition like the gamelan, it's already interpreting in many ways. So writing about gamelan by even a scholar like Jaap Koens, but then also people who were doing more literary descriptions, they evoke these ideas of this ancient, exotic culture. I mean, it's Orientalist scholarship, and it's an Orientalist way of thinking in many ways. And it was definitely a form of appreciation, especially in the 19th century, people wrote very positively about the gamelan, but they also heard these things in it that really signified that Asian people were profoundly different from Western people. And that includes this sort of idea of the timeless, the unchanging, this kind of cyclical music that just sort of melds into the atmosphere, and it's enchanted and magical and connected to these rituals that they didn't really understand. And so my interest is in sort of tracing those origins and to see how we still listen like that. And I think the way to listen in different ways is to really make that visible or audible or whatever, to make it more opaque. The way that listening, I mean, we hear something, you perceive it, you think that that's a direct understanding of that sound, but it's really shaped by so many other factors and these histories of understanding sounds and what they mean about the people who are making them and the places where they're made. So that's kind of the idea of this audibility framework. It's about not just saying, okay, a sound is made and we can measure it and describe it and it sounds like this, but to actually say, what is this interaction between a specific listener and a sound, and how many factors, historical factors and other kinds of societal factors enter into that relationship to hear a sound and to understand what it means about the person who's making it or where it comes from, or etc. So that's that idea.
Yeah, it will be very interesting to compare that perception of the Westerner to gamelan from the World Exhibition in Europe in 19th century, for example, because I get the sense it's not one particular opinion about that, because it seems to me when I did my writing on the Paris expositions and also in the Dutch at that time, it's they don't think of timeless and things like that, but in fact, it's really gamelan and dance are really kasar.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk more about that. I'm also interested in the 19th century expositions, and yeah, there was one in Amsterdam, and I think at the end of the 19th century, where there was an exhibit from the Dutch East Indies, and then also an exhibit from Suriname before Javanese people had gone there, and like the different ways that these two places were represented were just like two different worlds, and one was all about culture and music and food, and then the other one was just like pure kind of nature, like not attached to those ideas of like culture or human history. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. Yeah, that would be great. Okay.
I'm muted. Sorry, I'm muted. I'm talking. So I don't think there's a Usman. Did you have a question, or was that just a comment? Because I think otherwise, that is the last thing. And Usman? Nope, no Usman. All right, so I guess that was just a comment for everybody. So
yeah, but that's good comment. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, however we divide up people and understand them is different. I think these sensory perceptions are entangled with that. Yeah.
Cool. I guess we'll call it a night. I want to say thank you so much, Emily, for coming and staying up late and doing this lecture. It's been fascinating, and yeah, really looking forward to hearing whatever you're going to do in the future with this research and see where it goes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I'd love to talk more. Yeah, please be in touch if anyone would like to talk further about any of this. I would enjoy it. And it's great conversation. So thanks for all your questions and insights. And thanks so much for inviting me, Matt.
absolutely. Just let everybody know, next week, Sunday, we have the first time somebody's done 2 lectures. So we have Pat Midianto is going to come back, and he's going to do a lecture on the Gendare. So he's basically taking a music instrument, and we're going to talk about basic music theory, conceptual theories of Gendare music playing in gamelan music. So that should be very fun. Then the week after that, we have Ed Luna, who's going to be doing a lecture on linguistics in how it sort of relates to gamelan traditions. And he's going to be talking about this from a Javanese and a Balinese perspective. So that's 2 weeks from now. And I have a few other lectures sort of in the works that are not scheduled yet, but should be popping up in the next couple weeks. So thank you everybody for being a participant, and this has been wonderful. Thanks again. Have a good night. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.